Well, good afternoon, everyone. Again, we appreciate you all being on this church seminar with us. I know it's been quite a long day, but hopefully it has been something that has helped equip a lot of you when it came to a number of our speakers. We're excited to keep things going as well, and I'm so excited to have this panel conversation with two friends here, Glenn Wood and Dan Ryland. I do know beforehand I have to continue doing some of the administrative spots, so if you just bear with me for a second. When it comes to CPE certification, just know that this session does offer one credit for a business management organization. Partial CPE will be provided in half-hour increments. Please make sure if you're going to do this, log in with a unique link sent to your registration email to ensure that you receive your CPE credit. Also, participants must answer 3 minimum polling questions. So we'll have those popping out throughout our conversation. And then, of course, certificates will be distributed via email within 7 days of the virtual event. We'll also send out a CPE survey after, but if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to that email that is provided there too as well. And so this session is actually called Called to Lead, Prepared to Follow, which is on succession planning, which is a very prevalent topic right now for a lot of our churches and ministries. And let me just say that the folks that are going to be on this session with me, when it comes to Dan and Glenn, they provide a wealth of knowledge, not just because of what they've seen, but what they've also experienced. And so with that, I would love to get some quick introductions. So Dan and Glenn, and Dan, if you want to go first, please share a little bit about yourself and then, of course, your experiences with succession planning.
Sure. Thanks, Ken. And it's a delight to be here with both you and Glenn. I would love just to listen to the two of you, but we get to do this together, so that's good. So I grew up in Southern California and started off as a criminal justice administration major. Can you believe that? Was a private investigator for a short time. God got a hold of that, said, "That's not where I have for you." Launched me into the church. I ended up as an executive pastor in two large churches over decades and decades of time. And in this last one, 24 years at 12 Stone in the Atlanta area, multi-site church, have had a blast, see God's hand moving and people's lives changed. And the last 3 years have been in succession, and it's been a triple succession. So that is the senior pastor, Kevin, myself, executive pastor, and then the CFO. That's an undertaking, but it went wonderfully. And I can brag on it a little bit because Kevin was the genius master designer behind it all. So we raised up all three from within, trained and developed them for years. They're leading extremely well. And we're wrapping up the tail end of that succession.
Wonderful, Dan. And that in itself kind of gives some background, especially as you can see, Dan has a heart for this too as well. I would love to share a little bit of that for Glenn. Glenn, please share a little bit about yourself and what your experience has been when it came to succession planning.
Well, as Stan said, I appreciate the opportunity to share. Love you guys, and just the opportunity to get together and kind of have some conversations. So, I am the administrator for Seacoast Church. We are a large non-denominational multi-site church based in Charleston, South Carolina. I have been in. This has been my only position at Seacoast, and I've been there for a little over 30 years. And I look at it as job security because in the 30 years I've been doing this, nobody has ever come up and said, "Glenn, I have a heart. I want your job." First they say, "What is your job?" And then when I tell them, they go, "No, I'm going to run away now." So basically, what I tell people is, my job is everything that nobody else wants to do. Mine is a behind the scenes job. It's where I have thrived for 30 years. I get to do all the exciting things like read legal contracts and deal with business insurance. Currently, one of the things I'm spending most of my time in is construction. We've got several construction projects for campuses, but I also deal with our board of trustees and a lot of data analytics. I'm a spreadsheet guru guy, but from a succession standpoint, really just helping Seacoast walk through the transition from our founding pastor to our current lead pastor over the past probably 7, 8 years. Kind of it was a protracted one, but I think it worked really well for us, and really glad to share that. And also, again, these are some conversations similar to, Ken, what you and I had at a church network roundtable 3 or 4 weeks ago, and just talking through churches that kind of run the gamut of succession planning, everything from I can't get our church to even think about it, to I'm in one and it's going well, to I've been one and it's a horrible idea. So, there. What I can tell you is there's no one size fits all. But again, glad to have the conversation and just kind of share through and talk a little bit about it.
Absolutely. And it's just one of those things where you start thinking about it. This is a topic that's going to be prevalent for every church and ministry, and even for myself. So, I serve as the firm's church and nomination leader. In that case, I interact with hundreds of churches across the firm where a lot of this ends up being a topic. And I think that in itself is something where when we ask them if they have a succession plan or anything like that, typically it is a very mixed response. And I think that in itself will probably show in our first polling question, which I'll have here in just a second. When it comes to this, while we talk about that, and this is where part of it, I always love to get your thoughts on this, Glenn, and as well as for you, Dan. When it comes to succession planning, my first question when I start thinking about it is, why do you think succession planning is essential, especially in a church context? And what do you think makes that different in other settings, whether it's a nonprofit or even for a for-profit?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, but a ministry is a living, kind of breathing organization, and again, it rises and falls like a lot of organizations on leadership. And so, as leaders of the church, we've got to be looking at what are we doing today, kind of what's the next step, but not just the next step in the next 30 or 60 or 90 days. What about the 3-year, 5-year, 10-year plan? Because again, selecting a new leader, especially for a nonprofit, can take time, finding the right fit, finding the right personality, finding the right teaching style, however it is however you want to define the parameters. But I think it's kind of working through that process, and it's not a once and done. This is not something that you can
Sure.
say, hey, we did it and we're good, like we don't ever have to look at this again. To me, it's a, hey, we did it. And then again, depending on the age and the cycle of the church, could be every 1 year, 2 years. I would say no less than every 3 years. Pull it back out, look at it, look at the process, look at the people that you're talking about being involved in it, and just kind of refine it. You might just look at it and say, hey, we're good. But you might also look at it and go, yeah, we might want to tweak some parts of this. So to me, it's a living, breathing document that has
Sure.
to be looked at and managed on a process.
Well, it is interesting you say that, Glenn, because especially for me, even when I'm in a for-profit perspective, I always say, even when I work in other ministries, what they say is the moment you start a job, start thinking about start thinking about it for myself and for everyone here, there ultimately ends up being a time where our work is finished at this, whether it's a firm or a church or a ministry, and we want to make sure that we can leave a legacy that works really well too, as well. Now, as well as I finish this polling question, I'm sure for you all, you want to kind of see the results of this, because of course it is a across the board, an interesting breakout when it comes to this. It shows that, and I don't know if I'm able to show it on here or not based on the results, but 22% say they have a formal plan. 31% said 25% said we're aware of their need, but they haven't started the process yet. And then 21% haven't considered it yet. Do you all find that pretty surprising? Dan, what are your thoughts on that?
That's a pretty good mix across the board, not too surprising. I think there's another dimension to it though. It's planning is one element, but execution of the plan is another element. And
Sure.
sometimes there's a big gap between the two. And so that would be an interesting poll question, but that's a little complex to do, linear like that. Um, but chiming in on where we were a moment ago with Glenn, I think that why is it essential? I think it's kind of like a succession is like the baton handoff in a relay.
Sure.
If it's too soon or too late, or somebody drops it or stumbles, it's a disaster. I think planning the execution of that baton helps that handoff go so much more smoothly. And
Sure.
and then I think too, there's a, I mean, there's a blend and blur, and Glenn, I'd love to hear what you think about this, but there's a difference between transition and succession. And I just recently heard, and actually our news executive pastor gave me this illustration. He said transition is more like a light switch off and on, and succession is more like a dimmer switch, where, in transition, somebody just left, and now there's a big gap,
Sure.
and there's interim, and then there's a new person. Where succession, we're all kind of doing this journey together, and they're really different.
Oh, yeah. Now, I'm curious about that, Dan. When it comes to even succession, what prompted your church to begin thinking seriously about succession planning, especially for leadership and also even just for staff?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's a kind of an introspective, honest sort of, well, they're all honest, but vulnerable kind of question. I think we just got really honest about the fact that it's really easy for leaders to stay a little too long. And as human beings, I think it's really hard for us to see. I can claim self-awareness, and we can all say, we know, we'll know, but sometimes we don't know. And we didn't want to be those leaders. And so, but for us, it wasn't a way to escape the post-COVID church. We love the church. We love what we were called. It's meaningful. But I think all of us need to, and certainly we did, need to listen to others who are wise and honest with us. And sometimes even it became my mantra when people would ask me, and God just made it really clear. And he said two words, it's time.
Love it. How about you, Glenn? Did you have a similar consideration when it came to Seacoast in terms of what prompted your church to begin thinking about it?
I think one of the things that our founding pastor, Greg Surratt, as he started this kind of looking at where we are and where we're going as a church, and, among other things, the dynamics of the church as churches age, and, just trying to think through this is I think he felt like, and we as a church kind of decided that we don't want to kind of get to the end and go, wow, we should have done this 10 years ago, because attendance is declining, and all the metrics are going in the wrong direction, and that, as well as just looking at it and going, we need to equip the next generation. We as leaders, we as the old guard, for lack of better, however you want to define that, we as leaders have got to make sure that we can provide a pathway forward. And I think, and as we're looking at transitions, is looking at it as a marathon, that it's going to take time to hand it off well, find the right person. you know Invariably, yes, churches have had to, when something significant happens and somebody passes away unexpectedly, okay, that's a transition that you're going to have to deal with in the time. But I think, as a living organization for the church, we have got to look at it on the long term and say, we've got to do what's best to make sure that this church can survive and can continue as we get older, and as more younger families are coming into the church. They feel like they want to have a voice in the way it's run. And just because we did it a certain way 20 years ago doesn't mean that still works today. I think the mission of the church is still the same. I think how we carry it out, and I'll just pick on Seacoast, how Seacoast carried it out today versus when I started, when we were a church of 250. I came on, we were a church of 600, and we're told we would never get bigger than 800. Just things move, and we don't do the same ministry. We don't sing the same songs that we did 25 years ago. We've had to change, and I think leadership has to do the same thing. We've got to make sure that we're creating a path forward that allows younger people to get involved and help manage this and guide this and help the church continue to grow.
And that's awesome. And, I started thinking about that. One of the things that you just highlighted there, and this is what I'm hearing for both you, Dan, and for you, Glenn, is that it never was just succession planning was just being handled by me. I wasn't the only one talking about it. I wasn't the only one considering it. I wasn't the only one implementing it. And in itself, it essentially takes a team effort, both with staff and also with the congregation. And so I was curious about this. And Dan, if you want to answer this first, how did you engage the congregation and even key stakeholders during the succession process? Because I'm sure it wasn't just something that you woke up one day and said, we're going to start it today. I think it's something that probably took a process for you. So I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, it is a process. And I think it actually, this doesn't sound, exciting, but I think it has to start with the governance issues. because every church is, like Glenn has said a couple of times, every church is so different, wisely stated. Um, some churches just the senior pastor acts completely and selects uh, selects the next senior pastor by himself. I mean, it's just absolutely makes the choice. Other times there's a in other churches there's an entire selection of committees, and in the middle somewhere it's the board. So I think it begins there to decide, what's the approach, what do you have to do, and then and somewhere in the middle it's the board. But it's a process of change, and I loved watching the intentionality of Kevin as he was working with and coaching Jason, because he had actually phase one, two, and three, and phase one was what he called stage and staff, and he took them through stage and staff, from a myriad of things for over a year, from how to lead and preach at the same time and all that. And phase two was strategy and vision. Phase three was elder board and finance. But in the nuance space, I watched Kevin teach the congregation how to love Jason. And that's true empowerment. We understand leadership empowerment, but that's true empowerment when you're giving away your capital as being a trusted leader, and you're teaching them, showing them, guiding them to trust and love this one coming. There's a lot to it, from governance all the way to the emotion of sharing trust and love for somebody.
Wonderful. Glenn, is that something that similarly happened at Seacoast as well?
Well, actually, we were on a totally different trajectory when we started this. One of the things, as I've talked to several people, is you need to just pick a point and start with it and kind of figure it out. Some churches are incredibly robust, and you've got committees and a bunch of people that are involved in it. Honestly, in the early days, back when I first, when I was started and we were young, Greg and I would talk about it, and about once a year, he and I would sit down and he'd go, "Hey, if I walk out in front of a bus tomorrow and we've got to bring in a new leader, here's who I'd like to see." And so he would sit down, and honestly, it was he and I in a meeting, and we'd sit down and I'd type up the notes and just say, "Okay, Greg, you sign this," and I sign it and say, "Yeah, this is it." Just so that it could be as simple as that. That didn't necessarily mean that the church was going to adopt exactly who we wanted, but it was his way early on, before we formalized a process, to just sit down and go, "Here's my wishes, like here's what I'm thinking." And so again, it started as simple as that, and it was that way for a number of years. Again, he and I would meet, we'd fill it out, he'd sign it, I'd sign it, I'd give it to the board of trustee, head of our board, just so that another person had a copy of it. And that's what it was. And then, over time, again, governance, again, when you're a small church, there's not a whole lot of governance, there's not a whole lot of structure in this whole thing. And so then over time you go, okay, we really do need to formalize, we do need to, provide some guardrails and provide some structure to this. And that was part of what we did. We probably started it and worked on revamping our process over a several year period. But then again, it ultimately ended up in our bylaws. So it kind of says, okay, here's the structure and here's how we're going to do it. So ours started off really informal, and then it has slowly become more formalized. And I think one of the things that I said earlier was it's a living, breathing document, is that every so often we'll talk about it at the board level. Like, do we need to change anything? What are we thinking? Should we change the process? We'll look at other churches that have had really successful ones, like 12 Stone. They've done a great job with it, as well as some others that didn't go as well. Like, okay, what didn't go well? What really went well there? And should we incorporate parts of that into our process? Having done this for 30 years, and it doesn't matter whether we're creating a policy or a guideline for something, I don't want to sit down and write it from scratch. I'd rather
Sure.
take Dan's, I'd rather take somebody else's, and like, okay, 70% of this works, but this other 30% just isn't us. Okay, so we'll take his 70%, and I'll take 10% over here and 5% over here and merge it together, and that will become the process for Seacoast. And so, I think one of the things is, biblically, as iron sharpens iron, we need to learn from each other and, find ways to make it work. And again, I don't think there isn't one process, but it's a process of just continuing looking at it and refining it. We haven't, I would say, haven't had any major changes in the process, but again, there have been some tweaks along the line, like we probably ought to, update that.
And I think that one of the things you highlighted there is saying that there's not one set process that fits every single church or ministry. I think that's one of the things that I think, especially for many ministries, it could be daunting of even just getting started on the conversation of succession planning because they're saying, oh, if we don't even have the first conversation right, we're not going to get anything set up correctly. But sometimes it is just a matter of starting to have that conversation. And I think that's where for us, we start talking about the next polling question, which I'm about to launch in just a second. One of the things is talking about where do we even start, right? And this is where one of the questions, and as I share my screen, it will show. Let me make sure it's showing up correctly. I apologize, everyone, for the technical pauses. This is where a lot of the conversation is saying, okay, where do we even start? Is it going to be with our senior leadership? Is it with key staff roles? And that's where part of it is, we want to be making sure that this is a pretty comprehensive consideration because succession planning isn't just executive leadership or senior leadership at a ministry. It also impacts especially important staff roles in and of itself. And so, one of the things I was curious, and maybe Dan, you want to get started off on this question, was when it comes to even just thinking about succession planning, one of the first questions that comes to mind is, what were some of the biggest challenges you faced, especially when it came to preparing for some type of transition, whether it was for senior leadership or even for staff that you had to navigate when it came to succession planning?
Yeah, there's a lot of things in that one, Ken, that we could talk about. Maybe I'll hit on one or two here and see where it goes. But I think I think as I look back at it, and even for the staff and for the executive team, I think there was the realization that was foggy for a while and then became clear is that for a season, succession is the vision. And that really messed with us because succession doesn't feel like a vision. It doesn't feel like you're going forward. It doesn't feel like you're going anywhere. It doesn't feel like at least the drive we normally have. And yet, it is the vision. It is the path to the future. And if you don't do it and you don't do it right, all of the wonderful God vision that's given to you isn't going to work because you didn't get the leadership set up to lead the vision. And so uh, that was it was kind of a aha moment for us that succession is the vision. And then when you see and sense that, you can embrace it and put visionary energy to it, where at first
Sure.
we thought it's almost like building a building. Well, you build a building, but that's not the real deal. The real deal is the ministry, but you got to build a building. And we needed to stop thinking about it that way. Um, I think I think another thing that would come to mind is a key word that I think the key word for us, and maybe Glenn will see what I love to hear what he thinks, but is readiness. And and that's the key word. So the sooner you start thinking about it, the better. 3 years out is good. 5 years out is great. But when is the church ready? And of course, I know the statement is said so often is, well, the church is ready when the new guy's ready. And that's true, but that's not the whole picture. I think the bigger part of the picture is when is the current leader ready? Because if that person's not ready, it's not going to go well. And I think there are three parts to that readiness, very practical, to that readiness of the current lead pastor. And one is that, just to be real practical and candid here, that his or her identity is not wrapped up in the position. I think the second one is that they know they're next and they're new. And the third one is kind of a logistics bucket, but will he continue to attend that church? Is he financially prepared to step off? Will he have any role in the next? But those, if any one of those three, identity wrapped up in the job, doesn't know his next and new, or let's just pick the middle thing I said there on the logistics, just financial preparedness. I mean, any one of those two, any one of those three, and certainly more than one, can really set an otherwise excellent succession plan on its heels.
And I think that's great is the preparedness part of just knowing that, especially when it comes to succession planning, there's that balance. I started thinking about there's a balance of honoring, especially when it came to the leader that is leaving, and then also honoring the person that is coming in, right? And that's where part of it is trying to figure out how is the right mix going to look like in any ministry. And that I think is on a case by case basis. It's not going to look clearly the same that happened at 12 Zone like it is for Glenn at Seacoast, but it is something where we have to think very actively about it. I just see the results of our second polling question, which talks about the area of succession planning is more urgent. I don't think it's a surprise that almost 70%, it showed 68%, but I'm just going to round up. About 70% of them said senior leadership, right? And I don't think that's a surprise for you, Dan. And I don't think it's a surprise for you, Glenn, just because of the fact that that does make a substantial impact on how the church looks like in the future. And so I'm curious, and this, I would love to see, Glenn, your initial thoughts, and Dan, I would love to see your thoughts on this too as well. Is that I know we talked about, what does the leader that is outgoing going to be prepared? But how do we, especially since we're involved in succession planning, how are we going to prepare the incoming leader, especially when it comes to spiritually, relationally, and operationally for success, especially because I would say if you've been involved in this, you've seen what's happening at the church. And I think part of it then is saying, how can we equip them so they're not set up for failure, but set up for success too? So Glenn, I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
There's a lot to unpack on that one. But I think one of the things that we've got to look at is just preparing the individual and realizing that the outgoing personality and the incoming personality are two different personalities. So in our case, yes, they were related, but their personalities are different, and you've got to look at I think one of the things we've got to look at as we're talking succession planning is what are we looking for in a leader and how you define that. And that can take a lot of different directions for churches. But I think in terms of equipping them, we've got to really my side is more on the operations and the financial and the building side. And so as I approached this, it was a lot of, okay, let's talk about where we are, let's talk about where we're going, let's talk about what's the church going to look at 5 years, 10 years down the road. How can I help him understand the complexity of what it takes to do a building? Just because again, when we were in the middle of our transition, I started with Greg, and this was a 2,500 seat sanctuary that we opened in 2019. I started the design with him probably 10 plus years ago. And Greg is a visionary leader. He does a great job, but he wants to look at it at 30,000 foot level. He wants to have input on the front end. Here's kind of what I'm looking for. He wants to talk about it 2, 3 times during the middle and provide some input, but he doesn't necessarily want to talk about is it going to have a sprinkler system, or where are the bathrooms going to go, or how many bathrooms do we need, or like that's not something that he wanted to pour into. And so I developed how I approached Greg and how I work with Greg on buildings and facilities differently. Josh came in and was more hands-on, not necessarily, hey, I want to talk about how many toilets we're having in the building, but let's talk through it from a process and how's this building going to operate, and how is it going to work in between services, and what about coffee stations? And so again, I had to learn from him how he wanted to approach a building. Again, plus just helping him understand where we were while the building was basically under construction, had just started construction. And it's kind of like the train's going down the track at 80 miles an hour, and we're changing conductors. And I'm trying to talk to Greg at the 30,000 foot level at 80 miles an hour. And I'm also trying to talk to Josh at the 10,000 foot level of why that is the way it is. And so, I think one of the things, we have to do is make sure that we equip them well. Again, there are some senior leaders, and I'll pick on Chris Hodges. Chris Hodges is a great leader, but from a financial standpoint, he understands every debit and credit and everything on his balance sheet. I can make Josh's and Greg's head spins if I talk about assets and or debits and credits, and at a balance sheet in about 5 seconds. So, I think part of what our job was on the operations side was, let's figure out how does the incoming leader want to look at financials? Because I think one of the things that as Dan can attest here, you can take a set of financials and I can present it. I'm going to present it differently to our board of trustees, to our leadership groups, to our campus pastors and to a ministry leader 4 totally different ways, yet it's the same information. So I think one of the things we have to do is to figure out how can we best support the new leader? What information do they want to see? What information do they don't want to see? What kind of things do we need to share with them, and what level, and just understanding that as we're walking through this to help equip them is like, I don't want to dump, all of our, balance sheet and every financial decision at the feet of our leader and go, you make the decisions. That's unfair to him because a lot of times they don't necessarily know all that went into it. And so we've got to figure out what we can do to help support them. And part of that is figuring out how do they want to interact? What do they want to know? What don't they, do they want to let other people make decisions on? So I think one of the things from a helping to equip them is just understanding who they are, understanding how they assimilate and process information, and again, creating a framework that we can support them as well as, again, the church is moving down the tracks using the railroad analogy. It's going to continue moving down the track at 80 miles an hour regardless of who the conductor is. So we've got to figure out how can we help them, bring them on board, get them equipped without them feeling incredibly overwhelmed with the complexity of a multi-million-dollar organization. Again, churches, a lot of churches are incredibly small. 12 Stone, Seacoast, and others, we're multi-site, we're large organizations. You have, anywhere from 200 to 500 employees. And again, part of the new leader is they've got to understand, how are they going to lead the staff and what involvement do they have in this process? And, do they want to sign off on every new hire, or do they want let others? So again, I think we as leaders have got to help them to understand what they're doing, how they're wired, what they want to see. And again, kind of a long answer to your question, but I think it's part of the process of we've got to help equip them. But again, there's not well, here's the manual and it's a 12-step process. It's not. It could be a 12-step process with this later. It could be a 42-step process with the next one.
And I think what's great here, and Dan, I would love your thoughts too as well, alongside this and getting prepared for the incoming leader, is some of the things that Glenn had highlighted. I think how I would summarize it is there's a heavy emphasis on being proactive as opposed to reactive, and that's one of the things that I've at least experienced a lot of times. I'm sure this isn't a surprise for you all, is that there are many ministries and organizations that I've interacted about preparations, whether it's for succession planning or something similar. They usually use the concept, we'll cross that bridge when we get there, right? And of course, right, that never happens in any ministry. But this is where part of it is saying something crucial, like even like succession planning, it has to be thought out. We have to talk about it. We cannot cross that bridge immediately, but we also know that we need to have some level of preparation. I know we're going to have a question on, well, what happens if we don't have time? But this is where part of it is essentially saying is that so much easier, at least I would say for you, Glenn, I think you probably aren't, dealing with as much level of stress because you all have been able to plan it out in advance, as opposed to we're just going to hand it and we'll cross this bridge when we get there. So, Dan, was that a similar
Yeah.
experience that you had when it came to preparing incoming leadership too, as well?
Well, very similar. But I think what's really great about our conversation here is Glenn and I have a real balance in our roles. If I was responsible for the spreadsheets and the money and everything at the church, it would have been bankrupt years ago. I mean, bankrupt. I can barely add on my toes and my fingers, and that's the truth. We have a brilliant CFO. I was on for all those years, 24 years there, on the ministry side. We're all ministry, I get it, but on the staffing and the ministry architecture, leadership development, leadership coach side of that arena. And I already shared a little bit about the specific 3-year phase plan with PK, Kevin, developing Jason with those 3 sets of things, stage and staff, and then to the vision and strategy, and then last the board and finance. So I would add something a little different, kind of from my side of the table, and that is that we operated by I don't know what I call it, guiding principle of health for the environment. Because I think that if the environment isn't healthy, if we don't have a bigger picture of the environment, all the really smart things Glenn said might not work so well. And
Sure.
so for us, that guiding principle was, I'll give it to you in a sentence, and then we can break it down for a minute. is that I think succession is best accomplished when it's rooted in the prior generation and it's led by the current generation for the sake of the next generation.
Mhm.
We adopted that, and and it wasn't just, blah blah. It meant something to us, and here's what it meant. Um, on the first part, it was rooted in the past. It's more than again the verbiage of honor and honor cultures and all. It was very specific. It was building on the strength and the sacrifice that of those before you. In other words, mine the wisdom, mine the gold. Go search out. Doesn't mean, like Glenn said, you don't have to do it that way or do the same things in the same way, but don't skip, don't skip the learning of what got the church from nothing to where it is. And then
Absolutely.
the second piece has to be led by the current generation, obviously the ones who are going to be stepping in. And of course, that has great variation depending on how much time you have. Do you have a 12-month transition or an 18-month or a 3-year? That governs what that looks like, but it's led by the next one uh, because they have to make it theirs. They need to be able to. I'll give you one example. So I remember distinctly rebuilding much of the infrastructure of how things were done because we wanted their imprint. They were going to lead it out, so they needed to build their structure. And one of the things we did early on was give freshness. They gave freshness to staff values and staff attributes. And in essence, in the core, pointing to the past generation, they were similar in approach and philosophy and biblical theology, but they sounded different, looked different, words different, color was different, and they need to do that. We need to empower them to build this the way it connects with you, make it fresh, and we'll help you do it. And of course, the last part is it really should never be all about the previous generation. It should never be all about the one who's in charge. It should always be about the vision of the people for the people who don't know Jesus and the next
Mm.
next generation of leaders. That's what keeps it healthy, I think.
I love that too as well, Dan. And it's one of the things you have, it's essentially talking about it. It's not just about this one particular generation. You have to think comprehensively and throughout it, essentially talk about it's not just about ourselves. There's a kingdom purpose that we really have to be mindful of too as well. This kind of goes into the whole conversation of our next polling question, which I'll have up here as well, which talks about, I commend Glenn and Dan for the level of preparedness that they were able to have for their churches. But I do also want to be able to share some of the questions that could come up, especially when it comes to not being able to be prepared, right? And so this is a question I have for you, Glenn, and this is in particular of saying, okay, I know you guys were able to talk about preparing in years, but what happens, for example, in terms of how do you actually prepare if this process, essentially if the process was different because there was an immediate action by, let's say, the church, whether it's by leadership. Suddenly, let's say there's been an immediate leadership change, whether it's from moral failure or something like that. How do you think churches can prepare and be responding for that, knowing that that in itself does not probably give you the same level of runway as opposed
Yeah.
to seeing something that was more known in advance, such as a retirement or something similar like that?
I think it's a great question, and I think for some churches this is what holds them back of like just trying to figure out the well, we have to get it all nailed down. I don't think you necessarily do, but when you do have something that does happen in a short time frame that you now have to have a transition, I think I will start it and end with it. All has to start and end with prayer, making sure that you're seeking or you're seeking God's wisdom for your church to make sure that you're making wise decisions to help navigate this whole thing. We'll start and end with that one, but I think one of the things would be just communications with the stakeholders, communications, especially with the staff, with the board, depending on your governance structure, making sure that you're communicating the who, the what, it's who, what, why, when, and where, just to try and talk through this and continually talk about it. Here's the process, here's what we're doing, here's with the leadership, as well as I think honestly with the church itself, because again, if you have an immediate transition, your congregation is going to be in flux because they're trying to figure out what's next. They're trying to understand, the why or what happened. And so I think one of the things that we as church leaders have to do is we've got to make sure that we communicate well and we communicate often. I think sometimes, a lot of times, we'll make a decision and church will say, hey, we're going to go do this. And then they're talking about it on a staff level all the time, but the congregation doesn't hear anything about it for 4 to 6 months. And then the congregation is just uncertain, like, oh, like, hey, we talked about taking that hill and now all of a sudden we're not talking about it at all. So I think one of the things that I would say is communication is probably one of the biggest things, just making sure that you're communicating, even if it's the fact that you're communicating that you don't have a plan, or you're working on a plan, or you're developing a plan.
Yeah.
I think having communicating something, and again, even if there are some things, some of the pieces that you don't have nailed down, I think that's better than not communicating at all. So to me, one of the biggest things would be communication, just trying to talk through the process, communicate what you're doing. Again, I think one of the things that that I applaud, churches for doing, that are doing this, is creating a plan before you need it, before you get to the point that you're in a transition. Now, again, if something happens immediately, that's a whole different one. But I think succession planning should start early enough that you're not talking about names. You're not talking about, hey, we're going to transition from person A to person B. Let's just talk about the process. Let's talk about, what are we looking for in a new leader, and what are some key traits we're looking for. What level of understanding of finances do they need to have? Just, again, talking through the process. So if you're doing it before you need it, then you're taking the personalities out. We're not saying, well, Bob did a great job this, but he didn't do a good job here, and we've got to. So then you're talking about individuals. But if you can start with the process of, here's where we are, here's kind of what we're looking for, I think it helps, because it's less about an individual, it's more about the process. And again, taking some time to get there to help manage that as you're going through that.
Isn't it
I
amazing? Oh, go ahead, Glenn. Dan.
yeah, just a real quick thing, but I saw Glenn, thank you. That is so good. Um, uh, if I just threw a thought in there just to add is, I would say to them, don't panic. Number one thing I say, don't panic, because that's the churches I coach and consult with. They, in that scenario, they panic. And what happens when you panic is two things enter in the picture. One is drama takes over, and then there's often a power play. And so what Glenn is saying is so important. To resist the power plays and resist the drama, you've got to keep talking. Just keep talking for the good of the church.
I would say that, I think this just adds to what I was about to say too, Dan. Isn't it amazing how much things actually improve when communication exists? And it's just one of
Yes.
those things where, I feel like a lot of times, it's whenever I've come into these churches and ministries where there is a pain point going on, a lot of times it centers around the communication piece. People are not talking. They make assumptions as to what the other person understands and vice versa. And that even goes along in this case too. And that's where part of it's just saying, like, okay, we really need to make sure we're active, not just in terms of what we're executing, but how we're also communicating too as well. And I think this brings up a question that came up in our Q&A. And again, folks, please feel free to submit additional Q&As. We're going to try to give a few minutes at the end to answer any questions come up. One of the folks asked, especially when it came to the communication piece, is how do you learn to communicate? Like, how long is it taking for you to learn how to communicate with your senior and a pastor in a way that they understand and follow and track with you? Whether, I'm guessing, and this may have been from Glenn, your talk about how you had to talk about communicating and how sometimes it was so hard to piece things together. But in essence, how were you able to get it so your senior pastor understood what the needs were and how they were going to be able to follow along with some of the big pain points, such as a succession plan? So, Glenn, what are your thoughts on that?
I think I think it goes back to understanding who they are and how they operate. I think that's where a lot of this is we've got to understand who our leaders are. Again, some of them communicate well, some of them don't communicate as well, or as well. Some of them are, more visual learners, and so we've got to understand who they are as an individual and make sure that we, as the supporting staff, whether it's key staff members, senior level, whatever it is, whatever level that we're at, whatever position we're in, is that we are communicating with them in a way that they understand and they can adapt with. I think that's one of the biggest challenges. Again, I'll go back to the financial discussions. You know, I can shut down a conversation or have try and if I'm trying to talk about assets and liabilities and long term and short term, and then 15 minutes into this, I'm realizing that they don't even understand what I talked about when we started the conversation. So I've got to now go all the way back to the beginning where we had some common ground, and then figure out how to piece the conversation together so that we get to where we are. So I think, again, it's going back to communicating. It takes time, and we've got to understand how we communicate, and again, find ways. I'm a numbers guy. Like, I love a spreadsheet. I live in data analytics. You give me a bunch of data, and I'll find some common denominators. But I live in a spreadsheet. I know a lot of leaders that hate spreadsheets. They just think they're horrible. Like, so, Dan, there you go.
I was
Um,
gonna say, yeah, for you, Dan, then knowing that Glenn is coming from a perspective of loving the numbers, which may be something that may not be something that is your favorite, like you had shared there. Is that kind of a similar thing, regardless, this the overall theme as to how to make sure we're able to communicate with our senior pastors?
Yeah, the overall theme for sure is still the same. I think it often comes down to just the word trust.
Mm,
We have, in our staff values and things, one of our mantras is the last 10%. And so when we have conversations, oftentimes, in our Christianity to be kind and all that, and that's all good and right, we'll get everything said except what needed to be said. And we've got to say what needs to be said. But what needs to be said won't get said if there isn't trust.
mm.
And so you, th- and trust without repercussion. And so the answer to that question, how long does that take? It takes as long as it does you to develop trust. And then you can do exactly what Glenn's saying. Now you can have a real conversation and say what needs to be said, including the last 10%.
What you just said there, Dan, actually very much echoes even for myself in my profession. So one of my mentors at the firm, he utilizes the term that we operate at the speed of trust. And it's one of those things that you have to really be making sure that in these types of things, you have to be able to earn the trust of those that, especially these types of changes. Changes are very hard. And one of the things in the poll question talked about, one of the biggest hurdles had been change management. Because again, when you start thinking about it, a lot of times in a ministry setting, it is hard to make those changes. But if that person trusts what's going to be the end result as to why this is going to be a benefit for the church, the ministry, and for the kingdom, it really does make a big difference overall, doesn't it? And talking about the last 10%, and I know I need to do this last session poll real quick. I would love to get your thoughts too, Dan, especially when it came to just overall some of the things that you had seen from your experiences. The question that I have for you is, if you could go back and do one thing differently in your succession planning journey, what would it be? And I would love to have you, Glenn, also answer that after too, because again, we're coming from different perspectives, but I think it's still going to be such a big, big important factor to consider. So, Dan, what are your thoughts on that?
You know what? I have a couple of thoughts there. Both, I hope, brief. I don't know. I think so. But I don't know that it would be different. I think almost I would want to emphasize it so that the listeners don't wish they had done it differently. A couple of things to emphasize. Um, One is, I think, succession, the success of it is largely, not fully, but largely determined on passing on blessing over burden. And, I'm going to just say it more plain if I can, cleaning up any messes and don't leave baggage. If PK and I in Norwood, we hired this person, we did this, and there's, a gazillion million dollars of debt, we should do everything we can and did to clean that up and pass on blessing, not burden. And I think the guys would say that a job well done was with that. And setting them up for success, I think, is just vital. And again, that there's complexities to that. What if there's a sudden change? All those kinds of things. But anything we can do, I would do it. Last thing I would say is because it can be intense, and because even in the best scenarios, it's a lot of work and it's prayer. It's based on prayer, and not everything goes well. And Glenn was wisely commented on. You have to adapt your plans. I would say keep it light.
Mm.
Keep it light as you can. We had a little joke that happened like early on in the process, and it was kind of like, Kevin and I would say, hey, look, anytime you guys are done with us, just give us each a big shiny new red jet ski, and we are out of here. And like we're good to go. We're good to go. But then those guys are so good, they're so quick, they're so smart. They flipped it on us really quickly and said, by the way, anytime you two pull in the parking lot and you see two new shiny red jet skis, we're done with you. And and uh, and that became unintentionally, and then intentionally, we brought it up on purpose along the way, just to keep it light and just to give space to be honest and say, how are we guys doing? How you doing? Because I think when empowerment is in play, the next generation asks us to stay around, which they have. When empowerment isn't in play, then that next generation kind of wants you to leave. So I would say those two things.
Wonderful. Glenn, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of anything you may have considered changing if you had to go through that journey again?
If we had to do it again, I think um, I would say two things. Number one is communications, because again, I talked about it earlier. I don't think we communicate enough a lot of times as we're going through this process. I think that's one, and I think um, being able to have some frank discussions throughout the whole process about where we are, where we're going, what's the time frame, and let's talk about some of the hiccups, because invariably, if you spend years mapping this out, and you can create a great plan, but then life happens, and somewhere along the line you're going to get tripped up and you're going to have to adjust. I think we've got to realize what it is. Let's talk about where we are. Let's talk about what happened and the why, and let's figure out how do we go here, how do we go forward, what do we need to adjust to make it, to keep us moving. I think we did a good job. But I think, if I were doing this again, I think communication is one thing that I just don't think you can communicate enough. I mean, one of the things that Seacoast has done for probably, I don't know, 10 or 15 years is Best Christian Workplaces survey. And, and one of those questions is, you know, do I as a staff member feel like I'm brought uh, into decisions that affect me? Like, is that's I really botched that question, but that's the gist of it. Is our employees brought in, and I think when we first did this, I think the resounding answer was no. Staff didn't feel like leadership, and leadership was shocked. And again, I think they looked at it from one direction and staff looked at it from another direction. They both looked at the same object, but they didn't look at it from the same perspective. And so I think one of the things, again, as you're talking communications, making sure that you're both looking at it from all directions, not just from where I sit, not just from where somebody else sits. Let's talk through it. Let's make sure that we're communicating so that we're making good decisions, or we're making wise decisions, and everybody is kind of informed as we're moving down the path.
I appreciate hearing those thoughts and especially the encouragement you're giving the folks here attending. And I think that in of itself, you start thinking about what you just were talking about, the communication piece, the preparations, just being very candid with each other. I think you all are crucial to the reason why the polls are showing that 75% show somewhat confident to very confident about succession planning, because they get to hear it directly from those like you, Dan, and you, Glenn, and experiencing that and knowing that you can go through something like this too. I know we're a few minutes over, and I want to make sure we give a couple minutes for our open questions that are here as well. We have two questions here as well, and I want to be able to answer, or at least share with you all to be able to see if you can answer it. The first one I see here is, and feel free, whoever wants to answer this one, is the first one is, what can a church do when long tenured ministers are not showing signs of retirement nor wanting to talk about succession planning?
Dan, you want to jump in, or I'm
All right,
I'm glad
I
to jump.
will. I'll
Okay.
jump in. I think I'm gonna piggyback on what you've been saying, Glenn, is communication. You've got to have the conversation. So
Mhm.
maybe I can add value by saying, here's how to start the conversation is what do you want? What's your plan? What are you thinking about the future? Don't come in with guns blazing. Don't come in pointing. Don't come in doing anything like that. Honor the chair. But you've got it. Someone's got to ask the question. And because here's what we know. They are thinking about it.
Mhm.
Sometimes they just don't know what to think. They need guidance. Sometimes it's like, oh, I'm not ready. Okay, let's talk about that. When, what do you have in mind? Or jokingly, what does your wife have in mind? She might be ready, you know. But giving them permission to just say what's on your mind, or maybe those three readiness points, maybe one of them isn't ready. Maybe you can help that become ready. And so someone has to sit down, a trusted colleague, a trusted mentor, and ask the question, what's on your mind? What do you think? What do you want?
Mm.
You
I
know,
love it.
I think that's great. The one thing I would add to that is sometimes the reason that they don't want to have that conversation is that they're not financially ready to retire or move on. And so then that also kind of leads into the more communication of what can then the church do to help them. And that again, that's a whole nother webinar. But you know, what can the church do to help them get ready? And then more importantly, what do we as the church, what are we doing with our young leaders to make sure that they're ready so that in 15, 20, 30, 40 years, however long they want to work, they're financially set to retire. But again, that's a whole other webinar.
Oh, I know, and this is where part of it is like I have a ton more questions, and I feel like we'll probably have to expand even further on the topic of succession planning because of all the things that may be coming up. The last question I just want to at least share here, and maybe Glenn, if you want to answer this one first,
Yeah.
is coming from a person that said we are combining, aka taking over a dying church at the start of 2026 with a 6 to 8 month transition plan for pastoral leadership. Any words of advice?
Yeah, great question. Been there, done that. You know, we have, you know, over the years, Seacoast has taken on some churches that are dying and working through it. And so again, I go back to the same thing: communication. So when we started the early conversations with this other church, it was like, hey, can we keep our name? Well, no, because you're wanting to become Seacoast Church. Well, can we keep this? Can we keep so they were asking a lot of questions, and unfortunately, most of the questions, but the answer to most of the questions was no. And part of it was that they were wanting to hang on to the past of what they knew as a church, as opposed to looking forward to where they could be moving and having impact, you know, for the community going forward. So I think a lot of it is having those conversations, and they have to be honest. And you know, you have to be able to say, you know, we're going to have to agree to disagree on a few things, but we'll figure this out. But you've got to have some conversations as you're going through there, just to so that you know people don't walk away going, "Wow, we really blew that," or you know, that was a bad idea for us to take over that church or to merge with the church or give it what however it is. I think a lot of it goes back to communications. Dan, I don't know if you have any other comments on that.
Kind of similar, Glenn. I think that we all know that change, excuse me, change involves loss. So I think if not if, when you identify the specific loss they're feeling, and then not try to change their mind or talk them out of it or lessen it or dismiss it, but you can help with perspective. And so acknowledging the loss, walking with them in the loss, but then helping them see another perspective, how the future and the gain might outweigh, not outweigh, but compensate well for the loss. In other words, it's a good trade. It's a
Hmm.
healthy kingdom-minded trade. I think that can help the process.
Wonderful. Well, Dan and Glenn, I appreciate your time. I know I want to honor your time and those that are presenting too as well. And again, this is where part of it is I know this is not just a one and done type of topic, and it's something we'd love to talk even further. And most likely we'll have opportunities down the road. For now, for those that attended, I definitely appreciate you all joining us today at the seminar. Recording for here from Dan, Glenn, and myself will be available after. And of course, for Glenn and Dan, if y'all have any questions, please feel free to reach out to them. They are a wealth of knowledge too as well. So with that said, thank you all so much. Have a blessed day, and we appreciate you all being here with us all.